Hello everyone, welcome to another edition of the Orthodox Nationalist. We're at the end of October 2017. Some of you may remember that I believe the second show I ever did, the second lecture I ever put out back in 2009 was on Peter the Great. And for some years prior to that, I had been toying with the idea that there were two Russian revolutions. Now, of course, I hold it as one of my most characteristic and important foundations. That the first Russian Revolution took place throughout the 18th century, say from the abolition of the Patriarchate in 1701 to the death of Catherine the Great near the end of the century, almost exactly 100 years, was completely as revolutionary as the second one, which was, of course, the Bolshevik Revolution. And the more I studied, everything I read, which, of course, is mountains and mountains and mountains, both in Russian and English, they are very, very, very similar. And when I say similar, what I mean is that the cultural, social revolution, the complete resetting of the default norms of how people think, especially elites, were equally radical. Now, beginning of the 18th century, Peter the Great set it as his mission to completely revolutionize and remake Russia, to purge the Orthodox Church and make it just a docile, secular institution supporting him. The abolition of the Patriarchate and putting the materialist, atheist Theophan Prokopovich in Kiev, who had been a Catholic up until then, to head the church as metropolitan. Prokopovich was an atheist only in the sense that there was no providence. He believed only in material reality, but there is this foggy watchmaker that said it all. Some very vague concept like that. And Prokopovich has contradicted himself many times. Theology wasn't his concern. His concern was power. And that by the end of Peter's reign, he had destroyed, broken, tortured the bishop of every major Russian city and installed someone of his liking. St. Petersburg was meant to be a pagan city. It was a Gnostic experiment. He called it the floating city, meaning something that not only could go beyond, that not only could fix nature, but go beyond nature, creating something brand new, making a new nature. That's why he chose the swamps of the far north. There's not a whole lot of economic rationale there. The port city was brutal, very hard to get to, very rocky, very stormy, and in frozen swamp a lot of the time. The point was to have a place where his power, his titanic power, can conquer nature and replace it with himself, St. Petersburg. The beginning of all Masonic rituals, and he was a Mason. He was most of his mainstream biographers say that. There's a theory of Christopher Wren brought him in, and that it was done in Antwerp in the Netherlands, and this is his theory. Pretty much I hold to it. Someone did. If not Wren, then someone else. The point being that part of the Masonic building program is that you build something new on the death of your enemies. Life comes from death. Dead matter can create life. That's the central occult Gnostic doctrine, especially with the Masons today. This is just about the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So, for him, the traditional Russia was maintained by the Cossack host in the far south of the country. Once he conquered Ukraine, he forced the Cossacks to work in the far north, killing maybe 10,000. He depopulated Ukraine entirely. So quite literally, St. Petersburg is built on the bones of old Russia. It was built in strict geometric order, and pagan statues, mostly Greco-Roman, were at every major square. Traditional Russian dress was forbidden. You had to dress like a German or a Swede. Peter himself was not only non-Christian, but anti-Christian. Needless to say. His patron god was Dionysius, and when he first took power, he wrote hymns, which still exist, to the god Dionysius, Prometheus, in his mind, the benefactor of all mankind. And he had this unholy drunken sobor, he called it, of the new ruling class, mostly foreign, that he brought in St. Petersburg, and they all had, pagan names, and they drank, and they did these blasphemous processions throughout the new city, often raping women, hurting women, especially younger-looking ones who were probably virgins, and singing chanting these hymns. Peter took it very seriously. He took it very seriously. I mean, he had orders and he had responsibilities and duties. There's a whole literature he put together on this. This is not just some, one drunken night he came up with something. No, this went on for quite some time. This was Peter's agenda. He was a Satanist. So in no way could he be a monarch. Russian Tsar has to be Orthodox. Therefore, by definition, he can't be a Freemason. And he certainly can't worship Dionysius. That might get in the way of being Orthodox at some point. And there's no doubt, I'm understating the case. And part of his mission was, of course, to destroy the church. And he's not stupid enough to realize he could do it all at once. It needed to be a gradual thing. So he brought in all kinds of Western alchemists to completely revise how the Russians viewed the world and science. This became the foundation for the new order, the new Russian order. Of course, it had nothing to do with Russian peasantry. Peter despised them. He worked them to death wherever his projects may take him. He himself worked, constantly. He rarely slept and he rarely ate. And yet no one could keep up with him. He was almost 7 feet tall. And the only thing really, alcohol seemed to fuel him throughout his life. The church had been reduced to about half its former strength at the time of his death. Most church properties were gone and sold off and given to his friends. And hundreds of thousands of Orthodox were in exile, having fled the country. The Manyava Ski in Austria-Hungary is an exile institution. And it was built for monks who've been driven out of the country. The topic today, though, is not on Peter. It's on Peter's successor, Catherine the Great, Catherine II. Now, there were a bunch of people in between I've dealt with on this show many, many times. But Catherine the Great completed, or tried to complete, the work of Peter. And she said that this is what she was doing. But I want to talk about Catherine II, her relationship with the church, and especially with a particular figure, Paul of Tobolsk, who died in 1770. I've talked about Saint Arseny Matyevich, Saint Arsen of Rostov on this show many times. Great devotion to him. He was murdered by Catherine, so he was a new martyr of that revolution. Paul of Tobolsk was not murdered, but he was exiled, and with a whole bunch of other churchmen that refused the continued secularization of Russia. We're talking about the secularization of church lands. Now, usually a historian will say that that's nothing more than selling off property and giving it to their friends. They'll say something like the monks had too much power, they had too much land, and they never give anything specific. They just assume we all agree, and they need to sell off this stuff. So they don't like the monks, they don't like the king. That's often not the case here. It's amazing that the two people who have the Western term, the Great, after their names, were violent in their attacks on the church. I need you guys to realize that there's nothing special about Lenin and Stalin, except they had a far greater infrastructure to use, far greater technology. And the Jewish element in the Soviet was far greater than in this case. These were simply westernized materials. It has nothing to do really with liberalism or conservatism. It simply has to do with imposing this order. And whatever the best method was is what they accepted. In this particular case, because Russians were very wedded to the old ways, the old believer Orthodox were reaching well over 20 million by the end of Catherine's reign. It couldn't simply, you can't do it. That was old Russia. That was a Muscovite monarchy. The new Russia of Peter and Catherine was completely materialist. It was materialism, almost a mystic worship of matter, versus the old belief, or old Muscovite Russian tradition, which really the old believers are explicitly almost professional carriers of this. Neither Saint Arsenia or Paul were old believers. In fact, both had their problems with them. But the old believers grew in strength in Russia because the violence and the revolutionary movements of Peter, the two Annas in between, and then Catherine II, had reached an extreme. And in both Peter and Catherine's case, they say that they are revolutionaries. This was a cultural revolution. It's a great leap forward, as the Chinese would say. It is no less radical than the Soviet. The other difference between this revolution and the Soviet revolution, well, first you mentioned technology. The second thing is, of course, the Jewish element, which created a bitter hatred of the church and the Soviets. Of course, the third is a massive war, World War I, which exhausted the Russian population. And number four, a huge difference, is that in the Petrine Revolution, by Petrine I'm referring to the Cultural Revolution of the 18th century in general, affected only the noble class, the ruling class. It's sort of a tautology because Peter and Catherine actually created a group of new men, a lot of them foreign, that then became the new ruling class. But that's really all it affected. The peasantry remained very much separate from St. Petersburg, as they were supposed to be. Very much separate from this new official church, which at least in the 18th century had very, very few holy people. Arsene and Paul were, in rebellion against it. And Orthodox instruction and monasticism, publishing, was reduced to almost zero for a while. And it was tragedy. It was a tragedy. It was one of the most tragic events. And another big difference, I'll say, number 5, is that Russian Orthodox people don't want to talk about it. They don't want to deal with it. They know it's there, but because of the Soviet takeover, the murder of Tsar Nicholas, they had a tendency to want to romanticize everything that happened prior to 1921 equally. They can't muddy the waters by talking about a revolutionary movement in the 18th century from St. Petersburg itself. St. Petersburg is not a Russian city. It was never meant to be. It was never meant to be. Its language basically was German or Swedish. Russian was greatly discouraged, at least on the main Nevsky Prospect. And it, was condemned as this prison camp by most Russian writers, both liberal and conservative varieties. I mean, Pushkin certainly did in The Bronze Horseman. Gogol and Dostoevsky certainly the most, as a city of illusion. They're constantly referencing the Masonic and occult nature of the society. In The Double, for example, one of my favorite works from Dostoevsky, and the greatest work of Russian literature, in my opinion, Diary of a Madman by Gogol. It's only a few pages. It is so worth your time. You need to read it a few times to get everything and understand the symbol. But Diary of a Madman is, of course, a condemnation of the Petrine state, condemnation of Petersburg. But it's a twisted look into human nature such that we'll all recognize it, especially those of us who are on the outcasts of society. Anyway, so The topic today, Catherine the Great, the revolution of the 18th century, and St. Paul of Tobolsk. It just so happens that it's also St. Paul feast day today. And but it is true that Russians don't want to deal with it. The Moscow Patriarchate, every Sunday of Orthodoxy, refers to Peter I. I won't even mention his successor's name. It's too disgusting. Catherine II as right-believing empress and empresses. Right-believing Orthodox empresses. And someone like Mazeppa, who was firmly Orthodox, is anathematized because he was Peter's enemy, and for no other reason. By that time, of course, the church had been broken. And of course, when I say church, I'm not referring to the church in the spiritual sense. I'm only referring to it as a group of guys. And by the end of Peter's reign, most of them had no right to be where they were. They were his favorites. Many of them didn't know what they were doing. I want to talk about, in a minute, the procurators of the synod, which especially in the first few generations were a joke. Most of them were dismissed for corruption, and none of them knew the first thing about theology. It really was Peter's way of just spitting on the church. 1762, Catherine the Great, who had been a close friend of Voltaire and admired his ideology in France, had been writing back and forth, developed the idea, along with Voltaire, to completely destroy the church by hitting it at its root, and that's monasticism. Take the lands away from the church, from the monasteries, forbid them any kind of economic intercourse. And since bishops come from the monasteries, the administrative expertise comes from being an abbot of a monastery, and so much of the literature in Orthodoxy comes from the monastery. If you break them, the church is over, and you could use as cover that, they're living either too wealthy. You could sound like a populist as you're doing it. Well, it was, the manifesto was written in 1763, and in 1764, it was implemented. Actually, the manifesto was published on leap year, February 29th, 1764. Catherine says that the state is the most essential element in Russian society and in world history, in human affairs, actually. That managing lands is too much work for the monks, and therefore all lands henceforth will be surrendered to the treasury. Those peasants who worked on it were then called state peasants, and they had to pay a tax to the government of 1.5 rubles a year, and there was no corvée or no labor dues. The church was permitted no economic foundation whatsoever. Secularization of land, though, is more than just selling it off to your friends. Secularization is just that, in crushing the monasteries. You're saying a bunch of things. I mean, you're saying, number one, that society doesn't need you anymore or want you anymore. Number two, that there's a new order here. A very Germanic, Swedish Masonic order, and you have no place in it. Number three, our allies, our new friends, the new men that we're creating, the new bureaucracy needs land, and you have it. Number four, that the modern Newtonian world now holds sway amongst the elite. The old Russian boyars, the old class of from the old families was long gone, and these are often foreign, new men, and so much of the elite, the high elite in Petersburg, didn't speak Russian. Throughout most of the 18th century, French was the dominant tongue. That changed. Peter III and Catherine II. Catherine II murdered her husband, Peter III, and took over. She put 40,000 troops in the streets of Petersburg to make sure that there were no revolts. And that's how she justified her takeover. She was not Orthodox. Neither was Peter. She barely spoke Russian. So, a Russian empress, Catherine II, is a little bizarre. She wasn't Russian and she wasn't an empress. She despised the Orthodox Church. But Peter III, her husband, disliked it even more, and in fact, wanted to impose Lutheranism on the country, slowly but surely removing the icons and things like that. And so there were a whole lot of people not too sad to see him go. But that didn't mean that his murder was justified and that Catherine should take over. As it turns out, she thought the exact same thing. All those years of studying the Enlightenment and speaking with Voltaire had taken their toll. The establishment makes a big deal about Catherine condemning the French Revolution, but everyone condemned the French Revolution. I mean, it didn't mean you were opposed to the Enlightenment. It just meant that you didn't like all the gratuitous killing. The revolution was eating itself and then becoming a Napoleonic state. Now, of course, that hadn't happened yet. But Catherine condemned the revolution when it took place, despite her reign completely being Enlightenment based. She saw herself as an usher, cleansing Russian society of superstition, destroying the root and branch of the old tradition. She finally banned the Cossack autonomy on the Cossack Sikh or their main base in the rapids of the southern Dnieper. She finally destroyed it, breaking the Cossacks entirely. The Cossacks, from that point on, of course, have always hated Catherine, and they call her Catherine the Whore. And it's a correct term, because Catherine in her younger years was very attractive. And the main way she ruled was by getting concessions from men, older, wealthier, powerful men, after sex. The pillow talk kind of thing. It's like the murder of St. John the Baptist. And she was known as being very attractive, and of course you certainly want to sleep with her when she's consolidated her power. So when they say Catherine, they're not kidding around. She remained unmarried after coming to power, and had this succession of men. And usually after, she had a tryst for a while, got bored of them, and moved on. But in the meantime, she created almost a whole. These are wealthy men who had a network of men underneath them, and so she was building her coalition that way. And the Cossacks were saying this not as an insult. They meant it as an insult, of course, but it was a factual truth. There were 12,000 monks by the time Catherine took over. There were fewer than 5,000 when she died. She gave roughly about an eighth of the value of the stolen lands. And that value was essentially in the form of subsidies to certain clergy. So in total, 418 monasteries were shut down. Now often in the history books, they'll say that, well, these were of no significance, they were old, they needed to be consolidated. No, if you go to the list of those monasteries closed by Catherine, you realize that they are the most ancient and the most essential. Now, we're not talking about anything like the Kiev Caves, of course, which, by the way, is where St. Paul's from. He's actually Galician, which I don't think is insignificant, really. But St. Paul did condemn Catherine, called her the new pharaoh, and realized, as St. Arsenia did as well, and realized that this is unsustainable, that Russia is being dissolved, at least at the elite levels, and that there are two Russias that have nothing in common. The German or French-speaking elite in Petersburg that wouldn't know anything, they don't know anything about Russia. They rarely see actual Russians, because peasants were not allowed on Nevsky Prospect. And of course, with the old believers of all kinds of, every possible stripe you could imagine, that ruled the peasantry. So again, when we say secularization, we're talking about a cultural revolution, not merely selling lands. So a handful of monasteries and clergy were put on a very low state salary, the purpose of which is to make the clerical order seem ridiculous. Not only the most poor, I mean, there were reports from the Senate that priests were being beaten, kicked out of their dioceses or their parishes by the landlord, and oftentimes it was all sold to pay debt. And so you had churches disappearing for this reason. We'll get to the Charter of the Nobility here from 1785 here in a minute. It gave them the power to do that. But this was a revolution, destroying that many monasteries. And by the way, one of which was the great monastery of St. Neosorsky, that is on the Swara River. A whole bunch of them. And these were large, substantial institutions with huge libraries and huge traditions and sacred relics and everything else. Catherine the Whore actually vehemently condemned relics and veneration of saints. And one of the ways that we know this is, who they put in charge of the church. Peter the Great dissolved the patriarchate, making himself completely absolute both in religious and in political terms. He installed, as many of you know, the so-called governing synod. It had nothing to do with a normal synod. It was just a council, a college, that was part of the government, part of the treasury, actually, overseen by an over-procurator. That's not a Russian term. Overwhelmingly, this over-procurator was ridiculous, as I've said before. So, but in order to make this happen, order to make this acceptable, really, monasteries, they need to be in constant fear. Priests, clergy, they were terrified. By the time Peter was finished with the bishops and installed this brand new church beholden to him, you didn't have a functional Orthodox church anymore. You certainly had it at the local levels, and they had all the graces that they need. Good priests always have jurisdiction. Remember that. Good priests always have jurisdiction. They don't need a bishop for that. God is not going to send someone to hell because their bishop is a jerk or corrupt or not there. That was the case in the Arian crisis, where you almost had no bishops. The Serbian Slava is based on the idea that these bishops had, they were sometimes weren't even religious people. I said this to you many times before concerning the so-called controversy of nationalism, Philitism. So the Slava became this liturgical enterprise. The father of the family, the extended family, became clergy, so to speak. And that's how that developed. And this was going on, of course, amongst the old believers and amongst the official Orthodox, where bishops, they were quite aware that these bishops, not supposed to be there. They're just Peter's men. And they were frightened, and they supported his various heresies and things. Therefore, the remaining monasteries and parishes functioned in fear. So many of the old believers, they were called the cellarers. In other words, they just had another church underneath. And so the old believers went into hiding, as they had now for some time, and became the catacomb church of the day. And the cellarers were actually, just kind of official Orthodox people who, it wasn't so much the ritual that bothered them, but the fact that the state had grown, the bureaucracy had grown, standardization had grown, and that the church now was just a department of state. But that didn't mean that, grace wasn't present. Grace is not created by bishops. The Sobor doesn't create grace. Grace is always there. If you're Orthodox, but good priests always have, I'll say this again, good priests always have jurisdiction. God doesn't abandon his people. He's not a monster. Good priests always have jurisdiction. And there were plenty of them, whether it be old rite or new rite, that continued to fight this as much as humanly possible. We'll get to the Pugachev rebellion here in a minute. So I want you to humor me here for a minute. Those people who were placed in charge of the church, the over-procurators, started in 1702. And let me just go through a few of the early ones here. I want to point out a few things. Ivan Bolton, military man, no connection with the church whatsoever. dismissed for corruption. He was the very first one. Baskukov, the second one, also military. No one would listen to him. He was so corrupt that the synod eventually just simply said no to him. He was also dismissed for corruption. Number 3, the next one, his successor, Krechnikov, also military, did nothing of value. Strakovsky, Ivan, he was also, high nobility, military, dismissed for corruption. Alphonsy Lvov, he centralized synod power really to himself, and he was the one who put secularization into place. So he is, at our point now. Milosino, it's not a Russian name. Milosino was installed by Catherine. He was an atheist. He wanted to eliminate the fasts. He wanted a reformation. This is his own word in the Orthodox Church. He wanted to remove the icons, completely destroy. He didn't believe in he didn't believe in anything. He believed that icons were pagan. He wanted to reject and tried to get the prayers for the dead removed, and that he ultimately was and also a member of the Freemasonic Lodge. Chebyshev died in 1774. Was on record as saying he despised the church, wanted to see it destroyed. These are people who Catherine had put in charge of the church here. Most of them were Masonic. They were almost all military, and very few of them, they were either anti-clerical, anti-Christian, or they didn't know anything. One or the other. And almost every last one removed for corruption. Sergei Yakturin, again, dismissed for corruption. Apollos Naumov, Alexander Pushkin, no relation. Vasily Kovansky came next. Military man, absolutely no knowledge of the church whatsoever. Dismissed for corruption. And was really seen by everyone as just this arrogant, very boorish individual who didn't know about or care about church interests. Dmitry Kvosov, I can't read my own writing here. His successor, anyway, was a high-ranking Mason and founded a journal dedicated to propagating Enlightenment ideas in Russia. Alexander Yakovlev, finally, the first guy put in charge of the church who actually knew anything, who actually had any background or knowledge or care about church doctrine whatsoever. Nevertheless, St. Philaret of Moscow said that he had no right to be there, and he was dominated by lusts for power. All right, I'm done. This group of people, I listed the first 10, 12 over-procurators of the synod. These were the people who were placed in charge of the church and who were the eyes and ears, in Peter's word, of the state and church doctrine. Nothing could happen in the church with the bishops that he didn't have to approve of. He ran the church at its human, financial level. Almost all of them dismissed for corruption. In other words, their bribe taking and their pilfering was so outrageous that eventually Catherine had to get rid of them, or Peter, and those in between, and then Catherine II had to eventually just get rid of. Once the secularization of lands took place, you were now awash with all these funds, and you're selling, of course, this land immediately to your allies. There's a huge land market developing right away, and only those who had the cash and were already well connected were able to buy these up. Because of that, these over-procurators really were installed to sell some of this land to aristocrats at a very low price. Or no price at all. That's really why so many of them were dismissed during the Catherinian era. They were almost all military men. Now, I say that only because other than being true, it was a reward for meritorious behavior in the battlefield. So it was like when you were finished with your military career, this is what you do in your retirement. It's something, it was a joke position. It's something that you do. This is a thank you for military service. The first 13 or 14 were almost identical to one to another. And then you had two in Catherine's era, right in the era we're talking about here, the 1760s. One right after another. Melissa and Chebyshev, 1770, who died in 1774, but ran the church just during this period of time. Both were Masons. Both were vehement materialists and agnostics at most. Yet to have an atheist in charge of the church was not uncommon. Have a high-ranking Freemason run the church was not uncommon. Feofan Prokopovich, who Peter put in charge of the Metropolitan of Kiev, and who became his right-hand man in religious matters, was an atheist. He had been a Catholic. The church was nothing more than it's like a communist churchman during the Soviet Union. It was just a source of power. You had to put on the act now and again, but who cares? Prokopovich destroyed his political opponents. He drank, he never fasted. He's a fool. These people were knowingly bringing satanic practices into the church. Now, I want to stop right there. Going through all this, it's got to be horrifying. No one's ever heard this before. It is the fault of Russian nationalists for refusing to talk about this. I could go on. I'm giving you a really sanitized version of these guys. I'm doing it very quickly just because I don't want to talk about it anymore. They refuse to talk about it. The white emigres in this country, really, none of them liked Peter. None of them liked the Petrine state, or the Catherinian state for that matter, or the 18th century for that matter. But they're fighting the communists, so they can't, and most of them or many of them are royalists, and they didn't want to deal with all the blemishes. These were not real monarchs. Possibly the possible exception of Elizabeth Petrovna, who was empress in the 18th century, and who was actually, I think, a very, very good woman. Everything I've read, I've read, all the papers involved on her. Compared to the rest of them, she seems almost utopian. Certainly honorable and lifted the siege on the church for a while. I've actually been very impressed with Empress Elizabeth, who I have yet to do a show on, which is on. But anyway, but by any other time, she would be, average. But from an Orthodox point of view, she was almost saintly by comparison, what she was with. So the initial procurators were military, often Masonic, ignorant, deeply and intensely corrupt. Almost everyone dismissed for corruption. Ultimately, what happened is that the complaints got too bad, and they didn't want to hear it anymore, so they got rid of them. This land, Catherine sold, and Peter had done the same thing, by the way. This had been an ongoing 18th century phenomenon. This is the first time, however, that it became public law and in the law books. I do want to mention one of the most important things to take away from this. I'll say it one more time. Good priests always have jurisdiction. You don't need bishops for everything. It's an emergency measure, of course. The Orthodox Church continued to thrive in Russia, but a lot of it's not recorded. It's underground. It's among the old believers, people like St. Arsen, people like St. Paul Tobolsk, who led this quiet revolution or counter-revolution against the 18th century. It existed at the family level. It existed, I think the old believers are just simply heroic because there is no preservation of old Russia without them. They preserve the culture, the tradition, the literature of old Moscow and even old Kiev. Old Tver, old Bulgaria. Without them, without what they preserved, much of old Russia would have been destroyed. Peter the Great ordered the collection of all family histories from every single noble clan in Russia and burned them. This was the history of Russia. We have very little documentation anymore on the pre-Petrine era. We do in the Kievan era, of course. But in that Muscovite era, we've had to go to other sources. Peter destroyed all the extant histories and all the texts. The history books will say that he was just destroying the noble lists so that he can introduce a meritocracy. Alexis the emperor, just before Peter, did the same thing, not as systematically. No, that wasn't the point. Peter didn't believe in meritocracy. He only put his friends and members of the unholy synod in charge. So, again, typical Russia scholar, just an idiot. Peter didn't believe in meritocracy whatsoever. These were histories. These were the deeds. The point of these family histories was to be able to go to the emperor and say, we deserve a jobs and we deserve support because my family has supported this country for years and years. And so they would go through all the battles and the wars, put them all together, and you have a monstrous history of Russia, especially in the military and bureaucratic area. Hundreds of thousands of pages were burnt early in Peter's reign. This is a bit of a problem. So much of this history had to be collected elsewhere. The concept of the Mongol occupation, for example. We've had to put that together. Really, Mongols are not Asians. The word Mongol doesn't refer to a group of people just north of China. It's the Greek word for megalo. All the paintings of the Mongol era, the Mongols look just like Europeans. Genghis Khan was initially depicted with red hair, and the Arabs said as much. But we're only just now putting this together because this 18th century destroyed the history. And back then, where paper was scarce, you don't have computers, and you don't have the internet, you can destroy all the history. Now, they didn't get to every little piece. What we know about old Moscow had to be put together slowly but surely, and of course, the Old Believers are essential. The Old Believers did preserve all of this. One of the reasons that they were such a threat to the Petrine state is that they possessed the antidote. They possessed the truth that they had been trying to stamp out. The Soviets did not go to those lengths to destroy Russian history like Peter did. Peter ordered this collection and confiscation of this. Hundreds of thousands of pages of Russian history, primary source documents. Now, of course, Lenin and Stalin did this kind of thing. And of course, they had far greater technology and support to do this and far more money. By the time Peter died, the Russian population had gone down by 10%. Thousands were in exile. The church had been reduced to less than half the size, both in terms of membership and monastics. Monasteries were always the threat to the state. The threat to the state came from monasteries. And Voltaire's idea and Catherine the Great's idea is if you break them, you break the church, as I've said already. So, did the Russian population sit back? No. In 1773, finally, a massive Cossack rebellion broke out. Today we call this the Pugachev Revolt. There's one other group other than monastics that Catherine the Great thought was very threatening, and that was the Cossack hosts on the southern Dnieper. She demanded that their major stronghold, the Zaporozhye, be destroyed, and it took her many, many years, but she did it. The Pugachev Rebellion took all the outrage and all the anger of all this stuff. They were outraged at the fact that nobles paid no taxes, but yet were ripping the peasants dry. That serfs, for the first and only time in Russian history, actually became chattel. He violently opposed secularization. He was an old believer. Now, Emelian Pugachev, who was the leader of this Cossack revolt, and actually was joined by hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people from the southern part of Russia, claimed to be Peter III, the man who Catherine the Great had murdered to get to power. Peter III was, not that big of a deal. Why would he call himself that? Calling himself Peter III it's always, I don't believe he actually was trying to convince people he was. I think only modern people don't know that when you refer to a royal house, you're not referring to a person. Peter III was murdered by Catherine. Therefore, Catherine cannot possibly be the reigning monarch. No one ever thought that he was, when he was laid out, thousands of people saw the body, even from the provinces. So no one was going to buy that was actually Peter III. He saw himself as at least someone who had a claim to legitimacy, where Catherine most certainly did not. Peter III meant far more than the monarch. It meant Peter, the chief of the apostles. Peter and Paul, the chief of the apostles. It meant everything that a true monarch is supposed to be. He didn't care if it was Peter III or anybody else. A true monarch is a true monarch. It has nothing to do with it, and the crown is an office. Peter III is not a man. St. Vladimir is not a man. It's an office. Just like a bishop is not a man. It's an office. It's a set of ideas developed by tradition and natural law and, of course, revelation. Pugachev took most of southern Russia. He advocated the land to those who till it. 2 years, he took about half of Russia to himself. He had the support low-level nobles, of peasants, townsmen. One of the things that had developed in the Ural Mountains, where this began, was the idea of factory serfs. So not only were you a serf owned by some foreigner, but you were working in a factory in the Ural Mountains. It was a horrible, miserable life. They were slaves. They very quickly turned on their master. Pugachev said, a man who does this to you is not Christian. A Christian cannot profit at another Christian's expense. Therefore, their life is forfeit. And of course, he had every right to say that. He referred to bribe takers. Again, something else the historians don't understand. A bribe taker was a usurer and someone who was charging economic rents. He wasn't talking about bribes in our sense. He means corruption in general, but specifically usury. And I think that's actually been excised from the circulars that Pugachev put out. Bribe taking meant usurers. He meant Jews and non-Jews. But it was actually mostly any urban entity, Jewish or otherwise, that could offer liquidity. And in fact, Pugachev vehemently attacked the monetary system in general. He was anti-urban, anti-usury, and the peasantry, and the commune actually, should own the land outright. Quite properly so, Pugachev talked about the purification of Russia. Pugachev knew the revolution. He did refer to Catherine as revolutionary, and said it had gone so deep that this violence has been made absolutely necessary. I also want to mention the concept of the beard. Again, American historians have no idea what they're talking about. He stood for the beard. American historians have no clue what he means by that. The beard in all traditional societies, especially in Russia, was a mark of a free man. To be shaven, to be clean-shaven, was a mark of a slave. You note that Nero in Rome was the first to introduce shaving amongst the elite. A man's beard was a manifestation of his strength and freedom. It was seen somewhat almost like wheat growing in a field. If you shave it, you are infertile. I don't need to say that it was considered very effeminate. To shave your beard was to become a fag. And a cuckold, really, in that sense, because, as so many of them said, it was almost a universal European symbol for cuckoldry, and a homosexual one at that. To be the recipient of that kind of thing is what a beard, shaving the beard meant. It meant that you were a subject. It's like wearing a necktie today. It's a symbol that you are subject to another power who has a right to hang you if necessary. Shaving the beard was a horrible insult. You were no longer a man. You were no longer free. You were a child, a subject of pederasty. It's no accident that in 16th century France, there was an attempt to ban beards. Henry VIII, believe it or not, introduced a beard tax. Why? It's odd that the beard was shaven at a time when the state rose in power. Really, when the modern state came into existence. But the greater the level of bureaucracy and standardization, the more the state became preoccupied with shaving beards. Why was it so much that Peter actually banned beards in Petersburg? That you had to pay a tax. You had to pay a kopeck when you came in and out. No noble could have a beard, by the way. Many of them did in the provinces, but in Petrograd, mustache was okay, but not a full beard. Peter enforced his rule in an almost homosexual sort of a way by the shaving of the beard. It was almost a ritual when you got a job working for him. Now, all of this has to do with the rule of the new nobility. And I'm going to talk about the charter of the nobility that Catherine the Great wrote after the defeat of Pugachev in 1775. When he was defeated, the charter wasn't written until 1785, but it was a culmination of the breaking, the cuckoldry of the Russian elite. These nobles were not your boyars of centuries ago. These were mostly foreigners, of course clean-shaven, semi-Orthodox in some cases. Many were Masons. I don't know how many, but you can't have solid figures on that. But the Masonic lodges under Catherine exploded. The Charter of the Nobility, let me give you a basic summary of it. Catherine says that the nobility is to be decided upon by merit, and yet she says that it can't be taken away, and it can be passed on from father to son. When a nobleman marries a woman, she automatically becomes a noblewoman. So there's a contradiction almost in the first sentence of this thing. It has nothing to do with meritocracy. It has to do with who is loyal to the revolution. A revolution had taken place, and that all of these symptoms I've talked about already. Now they had to realize what elites were going to support him and what weren't. The shaving of the beard was absolutely a sign that I'm on board. However, if a woman with noble title married a man without one, she lost her title. It is property-based. You have to own a certain number of villages, and that's explicit in the charter in order to be considered noble. You cannot, and most of this stuff, of course, as you might imagine, is all about property. The Charter of Nobility ultimately puts the entire economy of Russia into the hands of this new class. You can own villages, and this is the first time that a village or a group of peasants is owned by another man. This is why Pugachev had risen up 10 years earlier, because this had been going on only in the 19th century, in the 18th century. This was Catherine's. This is what happened. The church land is stolen. It's handed out to these new men. Catherine's lovers, foreigners, those supporting the Petrine state. Now, Catherine turns around and says, now you have your own institutions. Peasants are enslaved by these people who aren't Russian, a lot of the cases, mostly Masonic, very liberal in many cases. These are nobles in a sense, not in the Russian sense, but in the European sense. The Charter of the Nobility was the stamp of approval of the new ruling class that Peter had started to create. These were not the boyars of old. A noble can't be punished without trial, but a trial is done of your peers. A peer, of course, is another noble. So new men can only judge new men by their own law, in their own way. So this created this inbred ruling class. Peasants could not do this. No one else can do this. Total control, actually, Section 27 of the Charter says noble has almost full control over all village production. Anything that is made or created or grown in a village is owned by the noble who owns it. Number 56 says that the noble will pay no taxes. He is totally free from state service and also pays no taxes. He owns no duties to the state whatsoever. And even more, not no taxes is section 56. And the most important thing, possibly, is that nobles, now they run the economy, they own men, they own villages, they're a very new type of guy, they worship the state. They now organize politically at the local level. You can't be a member of the village of the noble assembly unless the villages you own produced more than 100 rubles a year. It's hard to figure out what that would be today, but so all of these are connected. St. Paul Tobolsk was one of these guys who saw this coming. He didn't become an old believer, but he certainly recognized what he rejected the old believers on liturgical grounds, but he saw what was coming. What you see here, what I've been going through here at length, is the total bureaucratization and standardization of Old Russia, making it a highly Masonic, Europeanized state. These noble assemblies were Masonic lodges. You probably figured that out on your own. These were Masonic lodges. This was putting Russia in the hands of Luciferians. Now, of course, you had good Orthodox nobles. I'm not going to say that, because I'm not half-wit. But in the mind of Catherine and her boyfriends, Emelian Pugachev has been destroyed. Those elements are dead. The Cossacks have been neutered for the time being. The church, neutered for the time being. Their land's gone. Now, the charter of nobility, the crowning achievement. Now the Masonic lodges can rule pretty much openly. Of course, they were always technically illegal, but that's meaningless. Even if they are, so what? Nobles can only be tried by other nobles. So the whole thing was a scam. That means that Catherine did not rule absolutely. The Russian state was an oligarchy. The empress didn't have power over these guys, except by following this. Now, thank God, much of the 19th century, the second half of the 19th century especially, sought to reverse this. But it was too little too late. Tsar Nicholas II, for example, did not like this concept. And he named his son Alex after Tsar Alexei of Moscow. He rejected the new men. His father, Alexander III, rejected the new men. Unfortunately, Nicholas I, who did many good things, he was a Petrine. He was not a Mason, and he actually hated Masons, but kind of, the cognitive dissonance he I guess, dealt with the best he could. Nicholas I you can't compare him to Peter. He was not an evil man, but he did persecute the old believers, that is to say, the Orthodox Church at the time. So the Charter of the Nobility was the culmination, the synthesis of everything we've been talking about. And two saints in particular, St. Paul of Tobolsk and Arsen Matsievich, were punished. Arsen was murdered. Arsenia was murdered, by the way, in the worst conceivable way you can be. Kangaroo trial put him in a prison cell that was the size of a small closet. You could hardly turn around in it. And he was never allowed out. A little, 2x2, whatever it might have been, maybe 7 feet high, like a casket. It's 30 years. He wasn't allowed to leave there. He died by insanity. I can't even, there's no even discussing the torture. This is what Catherine the Great thought enlightenment was. Saint Arsenia is a great saint, and still is Russian Orthodox people struggle with him. Because Catherine II was the chosen of God, right? There was no legitimate monarchy in the 18th century. I've just proven it to you. You can't be a monarch without being Orthodox, without being Russian for that matter. None of these people were even Russian. It was a oligarchical, and of course the Charter of the Nobility proves it. This isn't Russian, this isn't Christian, this is pure oligarchical masonry. St. Paul, St. Arsene, are known by attempting to fight this rearguard action. And it's absolutely brutal. And that's why we venerate very much Alexander III and Nicholas II, because they, in their own way, recognize this and try to reverse it within the context of the state that Peter had created. Anyway, I've gone over. There's so much here. The fall of old Russia, 2 revolutions. Russia recovered vaguely from the first one. She's in the process of recovering from the second one. Anyway, so that marks the end of the show for now. Contact me if you need to. Thank you to Sven Longshanks for all of his hard work in this respect. For no money. Thank you very much. And I will talk to you next time. Bye-bye.